So what I'm going to do here is talk about the economic history of housing. The focus is on the UK for various reasons, but the story that I'm going to tell applies to a number of other countries as well, notably the United States. But on the other hand, for some other countries, it doesn't apply. Now, why does it matter? Why should we be interested in the economic history of housing? Well, the reason is, as it says here, that housing, or shelter, if you wish to think of it that way, is an essential good, like food or sanitation. In other words, if you don't have access to this good, your life is going to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Secondly, there's many myths about the history of housing in the UK and elsewhere. The reality is much more complex than the kind of myth that you get. It's not complex in a, or sorry, it's not different, I should say, in a straightforward way, as it says here, a rather more complex way, but also therefore a more interesting way. And finally, housing is currently the UK's biggest single social and economic and macroeconomic challenge. An awful lot of the problems that we face as a society can be traced back to housing and the way the supply of housing has developed over the last 100 years. Not an easy problem to address in many ways. So there are misconceptions, and the big misconception is that in the 19th century, in the Victorian era, most housing looked like this. The idea we have is that there was a terrible problem of housing and that the great majority of the population, the working class, if you will, lived in this kind of housing, terribly run down, overcrowded, dark, dirty, damp, and the like. You're probably familiar with this image, a very famous image of housing in South London in the 19th century. And this is the idea that a lot of people had of a rather dark, overcrowded Dickensian scene, in fact. I would point out, though, that even in this picture, the housing that you can see here, terrace row of housing underneath the railway viaduct in the background, it certainly looks to be quite crowded. You'll see all the washing there, but also it's pretty solidly built. And it is not exactly falling down like the housing in the previous famous photograph. But the reality was actually rather different. In the Georgian and Victorian period, from about the 1750s right through to 1914, there was a massive supply of housing. During this period, the British population more than doubles, and yet at the same time as this, and at the same time as there's also massive migration from the rural districts to the booming cities and industrial towns, the supply of housing kept pace with both of these phenomena and both of these processes. So during the 19th century, housing is built on a massive scale, and what you do not ever get is a shortage of housing. Now, some of this housing, like the kind of housing that was shown in the previous slide, is Spartan by modern standards. It's smaller for the space per person is much less than you would expect in a modern house. But generally, it was of good quality. Most of the housing was well built. It was well lighted, a big thing for Victorians, and it was generally of good quality. There was a wide range of housing, from both very luxurious housing for the upper middle classes and the aristocracy, through comfortable, pleasant housing, still often in use for the middle classes, and housing that was cheap and reliable, but of good basic quality for most of the working class. Now, the development of housing at this time was actually not, as is commonly thought, unplanned and random. It was actually highly planned and coordinated. As you can see, if you go to places now where you still see the surviving housing built for the better off, in places like Bloomsbury, for example, or Bath, it was highly coordinated, despite the fact that many individual houses were built by different builders. So this effect of coordination and harmony and planned layout, planned street structure, for example, was done not through public planning, but by private planning. And in particular, it was done by the use of what are called covenants, which are contracts, perpetually binding obligations, which are attached to leases or sales when the original agricultural land was sold or developed by private landlords. And so the reason why, for example, all the houses in Bloomsbury have the same basic decor and design, despite being built by literally hundreds of different developers and builders is because the Russell estate, the original estate that owned the land there, attached covenants to the leases which insisted that the houses built there have a certain appearance and style. And the same kind of process was used even for working class housing in places like Sheffield, Ashton-under-Lyne, parts of Birmingham, parts of Manchester. So development was planned and coordinated. One of the important features of this private planning, if you will, was that it led to mixed development. 19th century and very early 20th century development typically combined different functions. So you would have commercial, retail, industrial, and housing, residential developments all mixed up together in various ways. And one of the crucial aims of this was to locate housing within a reasonable travel time from the places where people would work or shop or get their entertainment, hence the mixed development. When the railway came along, and you get the development of the commuter railway, this process still continued, so you would have mixed development clustered around suburban railway stations. Now, there was one specific market failure which led to the kind of phenomenon that we saw in the first photograph. This was the provision of housing for the bottom 10% of the income range. And also housing for people who, although they might have had a reasonable income overall, were engaged in casualised labour, which meant that their income was erratic and not stable. There was indeed a market failure in providing housing at the bottom end of the scale, and that's why you do indeed get, in certain places, particularly London, partly because the casualised labour market was larger in London than elsewhere, you do get really bad slums, very bad housing conditions in places like, say, Whitechapel in East London. This is a specific market failure for that particular part of the market. Now, there was, at the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th century, private action to address that market failure. And this took the shape of what were called artisan housing trusts, such as the Peabody Trust. And this is an example of the kind of housing that these private charitable bodies put up. This is a Peabody estate in East London. And as you'll see, it's rather austere and Spartan, but quite attractive and very physically sound and salubrious housing. And you find housing like this being built all over London and a number of other cities like Birmingham in the 1890s and 1900s. So there is private action beginning to happen at the end of the century to address this undoubted market failure in providing cheap but salubrious housing for people at the very bottom of the income scale. However, there was a growing feeling that the problem was simply acute, and that the private action of people like the Peabody Trust, although it was good, was just not quick enough. It wasn't addressing the problem on a sufficient scale. Plus, there was a growing pressure in certain places because of the high birth rate. And it was felt generally, with good reason, that the real problem was not so much a lack of housing as overcrowding. Too many people living in the same house, not enough large housing for large families amongst the working class in particular, and also overcrowding in the sense of dwellings, housings being packed closely together without either green space or enough free space for people to do things, and therefore insalubrious living conditions. And so the response in 1919 was the creation of the Ministry of Housing, headed by a leading figure in the post-war coalition government, Christopher Addison. And so what happens here is that the state becomes involved in the housing process for the first time, with an actual ministry set up to deliver state intervention in this area. And you start to get both regulation, but also state supply. Now, the interwar years are a turning point in the history of housing in Britain. The state enters housing production on a large scale with council housing. And if you go to major urban centres in the UK, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, London, Newcastle, Glasgow, you'll see council housing from this period. Typically fairly large family houses built as detached or semi-detached houses with gardens. One of the main aims was to move away from the very high density housing that was typical of working class housing in the 19th century, and to provide more green space and room for people to play around and things of that sort. There's also, though, a huge surge in private building in the 1930s in particular. And in fact, in the interwar years, there's as much housing built by the private sector as in the whole of the last 3 or 4 decades of the 19th century. And in many ways, this is a great success story. One of the major features of the British economy in the 1930s, which was a decade of very rapid economic growth after 1931, is the great boom in housing supply in what came to be known as metro land, the commuter suburbs that grew up around large cities in that decade. But the private planning system that had been working before 1914 broke down. It stopped working in the way that it had done during the 19th century. And you no longer get the kind of mixed complex developments that you'd had in the 19th century or indeed in the 18th century. Instead, you get developments purely of housing with no other services or functions being provided. Something had changed, in other words, which meant that the private system that had worked so well in the 19th century simply stopped working. But what was it that had changed? Well, the obvious answer would be that the law had changed, but in fact, that was not the case. This change in the way the housing market worked can't be explained by a major change in legislation or anything of that sort, because there wasn't one. So what was it? Well, it was this, the motor car. What you get in the 1930s in particular is the advent of the motor car as the major form of private transport, particularly amongst the middle classes, of course, but increasingly starting to reach down into the lower middle class and even the skilled working class. The motor car, this is an Austin car, you can see here, suddenly arrives on the scene as a mass consumer product, as it was indeed, of course, in other countries, notably the United States, but also France and Italy. And this had a number of quite striking results. It led to a big change in the pattern of consumer demand. What people now wanted to do was to live in the countryside and drive into work in the town. They no longer wanted to live near to the place where they worked, or indeed, increasingly, the place where they shopped. The problem is this leads to a classic prisoner's dilemma and therefore a market failure. The prisoner's dilemma is that everybody wants to live on their own in the countryside, but of course, everybody else wants to do this as well. And so the result is a pattern of development which actually destroys the things that individuals want, which is unspoiled countryside. The rational choice for each individual is to move out a bit further and live in the countryside, but the problem is because each individual is maximizing their own well-being by doing that, the collective good they want to enjoy, which is country environments, are destroyed by the pattern of development that results from this. And so what you get is what is called ribbon development, where you get housing built in strips or ribbons on either side of major trunk roads. And this was boosted by the fact that the trunk roads were now taken over by national government with the formation of the Department of Transport in 1920. And what that means is that therefore there's a huge hidden subsidy to private housing development because they're no longer having to bear the cost of providing the roads, which they usually did have to do in the 19th century. And this also adds to the ribbon development. This is very unpopular. It's politically very unpopular with people on both the left and the right of the political spectrum. And campaigning against ribbon development becomes a major political phenomenon by the time World War II breaks out. And in 1947, the Attlee government responds to this with the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947, which is a revolutionary change to the legal and regulatory framework for the housing market and the housing supply market. It introduced the phenomenon of planning permission. Previously, if you owned land, you did not need to go to a local authority and get planning permission to develop it. It was up to you what you did with the land you owned. That's no longer the case. You can no longer do that. You have to get planning permission for anything. There were a whole series of rules introduced as well by the Act about what you could do and precisely where you could do. Above all, it divides land up by purpose between agricultural, residential, commercial and industrial uses. And to switch land or indeed a built property from one use to the other required the permission of the planning authority. You could no longer simply take agricultural land and turn it into housing, for example. You had to apply for permission for a change of use and designation. And it vested development rights and the gains from those rights in the state rather than owners. So it hugely changed the incentives facing private owners and developers. And it introduced a system that persists up to today. It's been significantly amended, particularly in 1990, but this is still broadly the system that we have. Now, initially, it seemed to work very well. In the 1950s and 60s, a lot of housing was built. Most of it was council housing, and most of this was built by conservative governments. Harold Macmillan actually made his name as a minister in the post-war period by being a very productive, if you like, minister of housing in the Churchill and Eden governments. But there was also, again, a lot of private building. Now, house prices were rising, but they rose slowly, and they also rose in line with incomes and with the general rate of inflation. So in real terms, house prices were increasing very, very slowly, not much at all. But then something happened, and the graph that we have here shows you what it is. Now, the graph is for housing in England, but the red bit before 1940 is for England and Wales. Sorry, it's England and Wales right up to 1965. Now, if you look at the graph, you will see there was a huge boost in housing here in the 1930s, which I mentioned. And then there's a dramatic drop when the war starts for obvious reason. And not only are houses not being built, obviously, but also a huge number are being destroyed. Then in 1945, you'll see that there's a huge surge in house building. This then goes up again in the 1950s, and then again in the 1960s and early 70s. Now, you'll notice that the peak is the late 1960s. The actual peak is 1967. And that since then, there's been a general long-term downward trend in housing completions. So you get a huge boost in housing up to the late 1960s, and since then, it's been downhill. And you'll notice that the date of the right to buy being passed, which is 1980, does not actually make a significant difference. The real trend had been underway for well over a decade before the Thatcher government passed the right to buy legislation. Now, why did that pattern happen? As I've just said, it had nothing to do with right to buy. The basic problem is that not enough housing is being built relative to the demand for housing by either the public or the private sector. Now, the private sector's failure can't be explained by politics because private sector house builders are trying to meet demand, which they had been doing throughout the 50s and 60s. So why did they stop meeting demand in the 1970s and subsequently? A profitable opportunity for them. The reason is it's caused by the supply side constraints introduced by the Town and Country Planning Act, the development controls that the Act had introduced. This chokes off the private supply of housing because it introduces the critical factor of delay. Now, why, though, did those effects not come into play until 1965? Well, it's because of the effects of the war. Thousands of houses are destroyed during the war by bombing and then replaced. Lots of factories are blown up and can then be built on. So basically, up until the 1960s, there's a supply of bomb sites, if you will, and also land cleared by slum clearance programs in city centres. And what this means is there is no shortage of development land. But once all that land that had been cleared, if you like, by the Luftwaffe and slum clearance dries up in the later 1960s, at that point, the supply side controls start to have a big effect. And this is the result. This is British house prices in real terms since 1952. And if you notice, they are pretty flat up until about 1970. And then since then, you have something almost like an exponential curve. You'll notice that there are slowdowns in the 1990s and after the financial crisis in the early 2000s there, but this basically is a steady upward rise. And it's a huge rise in real terms, which means that the ratio between average house prices and average earnings has gone from close to 1-to-1 in the early 1960s to currently about 8-to-1. So it now takes 8 times the average annual salary to buy a house, whereas previously it was a 1-to-1 ratio back in the 1960s. Now, this is not just a matter of prices, though. This has all kinds of very far-reaching effects, which I've set out here. It distorts the labour market severely. The high cost of housing, particularly in the parts of the country that are most buoyant, such as Southeast England, Greater London, makes it almost impossible for people to move from areas where the economy is less dynamic to areas where it is, because you simply can't afford the housing. So lots of people are stuck in places where they are less productive. They're either not employed at all, or they're employed on low incomes, and prevented from moving to areas where they could earn a higher income and be more productive. The point is they would earn a higher income, but even that extra income is not enough to cover the higher housing costs they face. It's led to a series of bubbles. We've had major bubbles in the 1970s, the 1980s, and the noughties. Each of these bubbles was bigger than the previous one, and each one burst, and in bursting caused severe damage to the economy as a whole, and also to the financial system. The banking system underwent severe strain on all 3 occasions and nearly collapses in the last one. And this is an effect of the way in which housing bubbles have been repeatedly inflated as a result of the way the controls have worked. It has completely distorted savings and investment. In the UK, unlike in other countries, housing has become the major form of savings and investment. And this is seriously problematic because in many ways it's not as productive an investment as investing in, say, plant and equipment, retail space, or a whole range of other kind of investment opportunities that there are out there. Far too much of Britain's savings is now tied up in the increasingly speculative asset of the housing stock. In London, there's an additional problem, which you can't blame on the Town and Country Planning Act, and that is global money, and the way in which increasingly global money, particularly the wealth of people who live in parts of the world that have repressive or autocratic governments that you can't rely upon to respect your property rights, tend to stash their money away in real estate in parts of the world that have the rule of law and stable governments, of which the United Kingdom is a classic case. And so therefore you have a flow of hot money into places like London, Paris, New York, the Bay Area, Budapest, parts of Germany as well, or Milan, which inflate the housing values in those particular metropolitan areas. So that's a very specifically London problem. But the national problem is the one that's caused by the existence of the Town and Country Planning Act's controls and the effect that they have had on the supply of housing. Now, this obviously is a huge challenge, and this is the point I'll finally conclude with. From the point of view of this history that I've given you, it's obvious what needs to be done. What needs to be done is not to go back to the 19th century, because that's probably not possible anymore, because we still have the motor car and other things, but certainly to undo a lot of the changes that were brought in by the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947. We need to relax planning laws significantly. Politically, though, this is very challenging. So this is one of those stories where the economists and the economic historians are all on one side, but the politicians simply dare not do what the advice tells them to, because politically this would be extremely difficult, because the people who already own houses do not want to see the capital value of their house decline, and they're likely to vote against any politician who does that. There simply aren't enough people who are losing out at the moment to put enough weight on the other side of the scale, although this may be changing. It's worth saying that many countries do not have this kind of story, and they do not have the kinds of problems that Britain have. Germany would be a major case in point. Germany has a much more functional housing market than the UK. It does not have the kind of history and story that I've just gone through. On the other hand, other countries do have this problem. France, for example, has a similar problem, and many countries have this problem with knobs on, you might say, to an even worse degree than the UK. The classic example here would be the United States. where zoning laws have had exactly the same effect as the Town and Country Planning Act, along with the effect of the interstate highway system, but the effects are even worse. Australia is another country which is like the United Kingdom, but even more so. So this kind of story is not a peculiarly British one. It's a kind of story which has occurred in many countries, but crucially not in all of them. And what that tells us is that this is a story that we can turn in a different direction.